Welcome to The Last Hike. Today I'll go over respected outdoor pioneers that spent years teaching their son that quitting is never an option. A belief that fear should be pushed through shaped every step they took, keeping them moving on Half Dome even as their son's fear and exhaustion built toward a breaking point on the exposed cables. Knowing what unfolded above still leaves a chill in those who witnessed it. It was July 16th, 2022. The trail to Half Dome begins at Happy Isles in Yosemite Valley and climbs from the valley floor to a summit above 8,800 feet. In mid-July, summer heat and heavy crowds, especially at the cables, turn the route into a slow, exposed endurance climb, where timing and fatigue matter as much as fitness. Lucielle Delacroix was 47 and had lived in Boulder, Colorado for nearly 2 decades. He worked as a professional outdoor photographer whose work appeared in adventure, travel, and conservation publications. Before that, he spent over a decade as a sponsored climber, competing in bouldering circuits, completing technical ascents across the American West, and joining expeditions in Spain and Patagonia. While no longer competing, he stayed in strong physical condition and was known for his long familiarity and ease in mountain environments. His wife, Arielle Delacroix, was 45 and worked as an environmental educator designing outdoor learning programs for schools across several Western states. Her background combined developmental psychology, ecological education, and extensive field experience. She held wilderness certifications and had completed long-distance and high-country routes in places like the Wind River Range and Colorado Rockies. She shared Lucien's belief in physical challenge as a formative part of personal growth. I can't help but notice how often couples like this build the same philosophy around discomfort without ever really questioning it in the moment. Their son, Lucielle Delacroix, was 18. He'd just finished high school in Boulder and was set to start university in another state that fall. He was going into engineering and computer design, things he picked himself. Really, stuff that fit him. He liked structure. He liked solving problems, working things out step by step. I'd normally expect someone like that to stay really steady under pressure, even if the environment is uncomfortable. He wasn't the outdoors type like his parents. Not really. He was more quiet, more to himself. He usually preferred writing things down instead of talking them out, and honestly, he was just more comfortable that way. His parents were fine with most of that. They understood him being introverted, keeping to himself, that kind of thing. But one thing that never really went away was his fear of heights and exposure. It had been there since he was a kid, and it wasn't just in his head his body would react to it. His breathing would tighten, his focus would narrow, like everything just kind of locked in when he was up high. Over years of repeated family trips, he learned to function within that fear well enough to complete the hikes they planned, continuing through exposed sections despite distress. His parents read this as progress, while he experienced it less as resolution than as endurance at a personal cost that became increasingly normalized within their belief that repeated exposure would eventually overcome fear. That belief system defined how they made decisions for him. They did not treat exposure as optional training or personal preference. They treated it as something necessary, even when it conflicted with his expressed limits. In their framework, refusal was not an endpoint, but a condition to be worked through. The Delacroix family had planned Half Dome as one final achievement before Lucielle left home. A permit system introduced years earlier had reduced overcrowding but not eliminated it, and summer weekends still brought delays on the cables as hikers shared the same narrow corridor. The forecast for July 16th called for clear skies and temperatures near 89 degrees Fahrenheit in Yosemite Valley, conditions that intensified heat exposure on the open granite above the tree line. My mind just goes to how that early start usually feels like checking bottles twice, tightening straps, and watching people already sweating before the sun even properly hits the valley. In the days before the trip, Lucielle actually told his parents he didn't want to do the Half Dome hike. He was pretty clear about it too. He said he didn't think he could handle the exposure, and he just didn't want to go up there, but that didn't really change things. His parents kind of shut it down. They told him the decision was already made. No back and forth, no real discussion about it, just he was going. That was it. Not something up for debate, not something to opt out of, and since the hike was still planned as a family thing, Lucielle ended up going with them. There wasn't really any option laid out where he could just stay behind. That way of thinking was really central to how the Delacroix family raised Lucielle. They didn't really see it as pressure. To them, it was more like necessity. They believed, from their own experience, that you build real resilience by actually going through hard environments, not just thinking about them or talking about them. Lucienne had come into climbing after some early athletic setbacks, and Arielle often pointed back to her first long trail hike at 19, done underprepared as a moment that changed how she saw herself. So for them, this wasn't just an idea. It was something they had lived through. In the weeks before the trip, Lucielle had quietly told a relative he didn't really want to go. He said he felt tired of it all, like these trips were more his parents' thing than his. He also admitted he still went because not going felt even harder, almost heavier than just going along with it. And over time, that expectation of doing things together, hitting these shared milestones, made it harder for him to say no. He didn't really ask anyone to step in. It was more like he was just trying to say out loud what he hadn't been able to fully say inside the family.
Honestly, I feel bad for him reading that, like he's already carrying the decision before anyone even sets foot on the trail.
Their experience in the outdoors also became a constraint on judgment. Years of successful ascents reinforced the belief that fear could be managed through persistence. Because that pattern had held across many prior trips, hesitation was consistently interpreted as temporary rather than definitive. On familiar terrain like Half Dome, that confidence reduced sensitivity to conditions where past experience no longer applied cleanly. Among friends and colleagues in Boulder, the Delacroix family was known as a capable and experienced outdoor household. They were not performative about their lifestyle, but their competence was evident in how they moved through it. Carefully chosen gear, well-maintained systems, and a familiarity with wilderness environments that came from long practice rather than image. Their judgment in outdoor settings was widely trusted within their social circle.
What feels deceptive to me is how easily that level of trust gets built just from consistency. Show up prepared enough times, and people stop imagining anything could go wrong with your decisions.
The permits had been secured months in advance and were valid for the planned date. The family had reviewed forecasts, route conditions, and packed accordingly. Water, food, layers, sunscreen, and emergency supplies were prepared with Ariel's usual thoroughness, while Lucian brought camera equipment consistent with documenting the trip. On the morning of July 16th, everything external suggested a routine, well-prepared ascent on a known summer route. The family left the Happy Isles trailhead in the early morning before the main wave of day hikers reached the lower trail. The air still carried the valley's overnight cold, damp, and heavy in the shade, while soft light filtered through the trees and the Merced River ran alongside the path. Lucielle started struggling pretty much right away. Within the first mile, he was already asking to stop more often, and for longer breaks than the pace his parents had planned for. But they didn't really slow things down for him. They saw it more like something he just needed to push through, not something that should change the plan. So the group kept moving at the same steady pace they had set from the start. The climb toward Nevada Fall gained significant elevation over several miles, passing narrow ledges above the gorge and open switchbacks where the valley drops away through the trees. Lucielle moved through these sections with visible caution. He placed each step deliberately, often pausing at exposed points before continuing. To other hikers, his movement could have been read as either careful or hesitant. He continued upward, and that continuity was what registered most clearly to his parents. Nevada Fall sits at roughly 5,900 feet and functions as a natural breakpoint on the route where the valley is fully left behind and the upper mountain begins. The view from the edge is both expansive and steeply exposed, and it is often where hikers reassess whether to continue. The Delacroix family stopped there. Lucielle rested, drank water, and stated clearly that he did not want to continue. The terrain ahead was more exposed, and he did not feel capable of it in his current condition. Lucielle stated clearly that he did not want to continue. He said he was not in a condition to handle the exposure ahead and wanted to turn back. His parents did not treat this as a decision point. The plan had already been set before they left, and they did not reopen it in response to his objection. They told him the hike was continuing and framed his refusal as fear rather than limitation. There was no alternative route presented and no adjustment made to the plan. After a pause, Lucielle rose, and the group continued upward.
He says it clearly, and then there's a short pause, then everyone just starts moving again like it was already decided. My impression is that it lands once, then the moment just shifts without anything else needing to be said.
The stretch from Nevada Fall through Little Yosemite Valley briefly levels into forested terrain where hikers typically rest before the final climb. The Delacroix family moved through without a significant stop. From Lucien's perspective, maintaining momentum still made sense, but the earlier delays had already carried forward and compressed the remainder of the day. Subdome is the final approach to the cables, where the trail becomes steep, fully exposed, and non-technical, with carved steps in open granite. Beyond the tree line, there is no shelter, and the slope constantly reveals both the cables and summit ahead, reinforcing the exposure of the final ascent. The cable section develops a subtle but persistent hazard. Thousands of boot soles polish the granite and leave a fine layer of dust that reduces traction where hikers step off the wooden boards. The rock remains stable under controlled movement, but exhaustion, dehydration, timing delays, and hesitation can quickly alter how it is navigated. Individually manageable, these factors begin to compound over the course of a full ascent. Lucielle sat on Subdome and did not immediately get up. His parents remained with him. The conversation was calm, but it did not change direction. The expectation to continue remained intact, and the pause was treated as something to move through rather than a signal to stop. When he finally rose, his movement toward the cables became visibly altered, no longer fluid walking, but step-by-step initiation with hesitation before each weight transfer, tightened posture, and constant reliance on nearby rock for stability. It reflected a compounded fear and fatigue response that narrows attention and disrupts the automatic balance adjustments that normally stabilize movement on exposed terrain, increasing effort while reducing coordination. At the cable section, peak season congestion meant slow bidirectional flow with frequent stops. Wooden boards provided intermittent footing, while exposed granite between them was worn smooth by summer traffic and coated with fine dust that reduced traction in places. Lucielle had to stop several times once they got to the cable section, and each time, it wasn't something he just pushed through on his own. His parents had to actively step in, talk him through it, get him moving again. They basically kept him between them, Lucien below and Ariel above, holding that kind of steady spacing so he could keep going one step at a time. It was slow, really slow, honestly. A lot of stopping, a lot of starting again, but even with all of that, all the delays and pauses, they did eventually make it to the summit.
I think it's not even one continuous climb at that point. It's more like a series of stops where movement only resumes after someone else re-engages him each time.
The summit was reached about 2 hours later than Lucien's planned timing. The top of Half Dome is broad and relatively flat, and from its center, the difficulty of the descent is not immediately apparent, giving hikers a brief sense that the hardest section is behind them. Several hikers later recalled the Delacroix family as a group of three, two experienced adults and a teenager who sat down quickly after arrival and did not engage with the view. Lucielle ate very little, drank water, and remained mostly still, described afterward as distant, exhausted, or blank, consistent with severe physical and emotional depletion after sustained exertion under stress. Lucien moved around the summit, taking photographs in a habitual way, focused on the late afternoon light across surrounding granite. Ariel stayed near Lucielle, sitting with him and speaking quietly. To outside observers, nothing appeared unusual. A family resting after a long hike, with no visible conflict and only the typical fatigue of a long ascent. The afternoon continued to advance, and the sun shifted toward the western side of the sky. On the summit of Half Dome, hikers began preparing for descent, guided by an unspoken awareness of time, distance, and the need to clear the cables before light faded. The Delacroix family started later than most, and by the time they moved toward the cable section, a queue had already formed at the top, adding further delay to an already compressed schedule. While waiting, Lucielle's legs began to shake visibly. The tremors reflected sustained muscular fatigue after a full day of continuous exertion in heat and elevation, where the body's ability to maintain precise motor control began to degrade. He was still capable of movement, but the stability required for confident stepping had narrowed significantly, making each action more deliberate and less reliable.
Just standing at the top there, it already feels like the body is done holding steady, even before the descent actually starts.
His parents stayed really close to him the whole time. That pattern they'd fallen into on the way up just kind of continued into the descent too. They were always within arm's reach, shifting around depending on the terrain, keeping that tight formation that had helped them get to the top. But going down is a different thing. On a descent like that, you usually want more space between people, more independence with your footing, just a bit of separation so each person can move safely through those exposed sections. Still, they didn't really change how they were doing it. They stayed clustered together, the same tight setup they'd used on the way up, even though the conditions had shifted. And that matters more than it sounds. The descent of the cables is often harder on people mentally than going up. On the way up, the drop is mostly behind you, but going down flips everything. You're suddenly facing it. Every step, the valley is right there in front of you, open and deep. The slope feels steeper just because of how you see it. So for someone already dealing with fear tied to exposure, the descent isn't just going back down. It's a different kind of pressure entirely.
If it were me there, I'd already feel like I need a bit of space just to place each foot properly without bumping into someone right above or below me.
Lucielle's descent was described by nearby hikers as mechanical and overly deliberate, with each step taken as a separate decision rather than part of a continuous balance rhythm. It reflected a pattern seen when fear and fatigue disrupt normal motor efficiency, increasing effort while reducing stability on exposed terrain. The cable section was congested in both directions, with hikers behind the family forced into slow, intermittent movement as space opened ahead. There was no conflict or urgency, only the usual compression of peak season traffic, though several hikers hikers later noted a quiet unease watching the family's slowed, visibly strained descent. By mid-afternoon, the family was about halfway down the cable section of Half Dome. They had already cleared the steepest upper pitch and were moving through a slightly less severe middle section, though still fully exposed and congested with both ascending and descending hikers. The flow of traffic remained continuous but uneven, with frequent pauses as groups waited for space to open. A hiker 2 positions ahead of Lucielle slipped briefly. The loss of footing was momentary and immediately corrected with a grip on the cable, resulting in no fall or injury. However, the sudden movement and reaction nearby created a sharp sound and visible startle response among surrounding hikers. Lucielle reacted instantly, his hands tightened on the cables, and his movement stopped completely. He ended up frozen there on the slope, unable to move forward again. Pretty quickly, other hikers around them had to stop too, and the line behind started to bunch up. It didn't last very long, some accounts say maybe a minute or two, but in that short stretch of time, it changed the feel of everything. What was just a brief pause turned into a visible blockage on an exposed part of the descent, and Lucielle was caught in it, stuck between knowing he couldn't really take another step and feeling the pressure building behind him as more and more hikers waited for the group to move again.
People are literally right behind him on the same cable section, just standing there in place. And there's that awkward silence where nobody can pass and everyone's just waiting for him to start moving again.
After the brief stoppage, Lucielle resumed movement. He took one step, then another, transitioning between boards in a section where the wooden slats are separated by exposed granite. His left foot landed on the open rock between boards, a surface that in mid-July conditions is typically worn smooth and coated with fine debris from repeated traffic. The boot failed to find sufficient friction to stabilize the step. The slip itself wasn't anything unusual for that kind of terrain. It can happen pretty easily on those granite steps. What made it harder to recover from was the way they were still operating as a tightly connected group at that moment. There wasn't much independent stability between them anymore. Each movement and correction was happening through the others. So the same system that had helped keep Lucielle moving upward just didn't translate well to the descent. On the way down, that kind of linked movement doesn't give you the same control, especially on exposed rock where each person really needs their own steady footing.
I just see it as 3 people sharing balance in the same moment, instead of each one having space to reset their own footing.
The resulting slip was not abrupt, but continuous, as his momentum carried forward while his foot continued moving downslope. His body began to rotate as his center of gravity shifted away from the vertical line defined by the cable. On a steep, exposed surface, that rotation quickly becomes critical because it removes the ability to re-establish balance through normal foot correction alone. Lucian, positioned below and slightly to the side, reacted immediately and grabbed for Lucielle's backpack. The contact was firm, but it engaged a body already rotating and moving under its own momentum, producing a partial redirection rather than a full arrest of motion. At the same time, Ariel reached from above, attempting to intervene as the space between them closed. The combined responses occurred within the same instant, as the family's clustered positioning limited separation and left all 3 within the same immediate zone of movement on the slope. The 3 of them, in the moments that followed, ceased to function as separate, independently stable climbers. They became a single, interlinked system on a steep, exposed surface that does not accommodate shared loss of balance. Any remaining contact each had with the cables was no longer sufficient to counter the combined shifts in weight and momentum, and the clustered positioning removed the separation that would normally allow one person to stabilize while another recovered.
3 people staying that close on the cables, where one movement immediately affects the others before anyone can reset their footing. It seems to me like there's no real space for anyone to recover balance on their own.
The loss of contact with the cables happened in rapid succession, over a span of only seconds. Hikers nearby later described it as a continuous motion rather than a series of distinct events. Once their grips failed, they moved below the cable line, onto the open granite slabs, adjacent to the route terrain that is unprotected, unbroken, and offers no meaningful features for arresting movement. Multiple hikers witnessed the descent from the cable corridor. Their accounts were consistent in describing it as a single, uninterrupted sequence with no viable window for intervention. From the point of initial slip to the moment the group passed out of reach, the event unfolded too quickly for coordinated response from those above. The Delacroix family fell several hundred feet down the granite slabs beside the cable route.
I just read it as how fast things move once control is lost, with no real time for anyone above to step in.
Hikers on the cables raised the alarm immediately. The park's emergency communication system was activated, and Yosemite Search and Rescue alongside National Park Service rangers were mobilized within minutes. A helicopter was launched shortly afterward. The cable route was closed, and response efforts began alongside the management of hundreds of hikers still distributed across the upper mountain, including those at the cables, on Subdome, and along the approach trail. All 3 members of the Delacroix family were located on the granite below the cable corridor and pronounced dead at the scene by responding personnel. Recovery operations and the evacuation of stranded hikers continued into the evening, and next of kin were notified that night. The medical examiner's findings and the subsequent National Park Service review were consistent. The deaths resulted from severe traumatic injuries sustained in a high-energy fall across exposed granite, with injuries deemed non-survivable. No evidence was found of mechanical failure, weather-related causation, or trail infrastructure issues beyond normal seasonal conditions. The contributing factors were identified as cumulative rather than singular: sustained physical fatigue from a full-day ascent in summer heat, delayed timing compressing the descent window, congestion and psychological strain at the cable section, and the documented severity of Lucielle's exposure-related anxiety under exertion. The review also noted the role of sustained physical clustering during the descent, which reduced independent stability on a section of terrain where separation and individual balance management are typically critical.